Good morning and welcome to everybody. We are thrilled to see you back, a good portion of you, and we are also thrilled to see quite a few guests that are new or participants who are, particularly for this day here, we welcome you all. We had a good start yesterday. We were reflecting with Professor Volf on the effect of globalization on religion, on the church, and then the church's effect on globalization. And we were also discussing different breakout sessions, different aspects of globalization. So it was a good start. And today we come, second day, to some hot topics. And it might get a little warmer also today, so we'll see where that leads. I would like to make a few comments in the beginning. Si vous avez besoin de traduction, il y a la possibilité, il faut prendre une machine là. Wenn Sie Übersetzung benötigen oder gerne haben, dann brauchen Sie so einen Kopfhörer, den gibt es da oben und den sollte man dann beim Verlassen des Saals auch bitte wieder hier lassen. We have a book table out there, and I would like to draw your attention to three things that might be interesting. First of all, one of the breakout speakers is Professor Delgado, and yesterday we had Professor Vergauen. They together have written a book, Glaube und Vernunft, Theologie und Philosophie. If you go out in the hall on the left side, there's a book table with 3 books. Help yourself. These are all the books that need to go. This one is there also, so if you're interested, check out. First come, first serve in the break, not now. A second book we would like to draw your attention to is by N.T. Wright, Rechtfertigung, Gottes Plan und die Sicht des Paulus. This is very new from the press, just a few weeks ago, and Professor Hallensleben has been der Herausgeber dieses Buches, together with Simon Dürr, and the translation is new. It's pretty extensively worked over, and there is a speech, which is a summary of his book that he has given when he was here at the university receiving his honorary doctor. That's also included in the book. That's not available in the English. So that book is available. And then today, of course, we have quite a few books from Professor Miroslav Volf. Today's book that would probably be most interesting, Allah, A Christian Response, is available at the bookstore with some discount for the conference. So I think that's enough news. We'll hear more later. We would like to just quickly reintroduce, for those who are new, Professor Miroslav Volf. He is the Henry B. Wright Professor for Systematic Theology at the Yale University. He is also founder and director of the Yale Center for Faith and Culture. And I think some of his books have become pretty famous. One of the probably most famous or most popular, I don't know what the right word is, would be Exclusion and Embrace, that has won an award. That book is also available outside. Miroslav Volf was born 56 in Croatia. He studied in Zagreb at Fuller Theological Seminary, and he got his doctorate and habilitated with Jürgen Moltmann in Germany. And now, as we said, he is professor in Yale, and I think it would be great to welcome Professor Volf with a very warm applause.
So good morning to all of you. The topic today, this morning, is a relationship between religious exclusivism and political pluralism. Now, the topic of these series of lectures was also a topic of a course that I have taught at Yale University for 4 consecutive years. Every single time, on every single first session in these 4 years, the question of the relationship between religious exclusivism and political pluralism was raised. I remember first time when we taught the course, at that time I taught it actually with Prime Minister Tony Blair. When we taught this course, after we finished discussing the relationship between religions and kind of pluralizing forces of globalization processes, a Muslim PhD student, doctoral student at Yale raised his hand. He's become a good friend of mine in the meantime, Yasser Kazi, and he raised the question. How can we say that people who we believe will be damned, people who we believe follow the wrong path, how can we allow for people like this within the political society to have exactly equal rights as other people? And the idea is that somehow a religious exclusivism has, as a consequence, political exclusivism as well. That's on the one side of things. If you invert it, there are those who are religious pluralists. They sometimes believe also that it's impossible for you to be religious exclusivist and political pluralist, so that religious and political pluralism are aligned on the one side, religious and political exclusivism are aligned on the other side. Now, my contention this morning is that actually it is possible to be religious exclusivist and to embrace pluralism as a political project. This is relatively new contention, but I think it's plausible, and I hope you all will be converts by the end of this talk that I will give. So let me first say a few introductory comments about the relationship of what I have described earlier yesterday of world religions and religious freedom, of world religions and political pluralism, right? Now, this is general description of world religions in relationship to religious freedom and political pluralism. Then I will go to more specific case of world religions that understand themselves in exclusivistic way and ask the question why and how, for what reason they may or may not embrace pluralism as a political project. Now, you'll see that my operative assumption, and some of you might disagree with that too, my operative assumption is that political pluralism is a good thing. Not all people agree with this, obviously, and we can discuss that at some point as well. So roughly then, my outline of my talk this morning is I will speak more generally about relationship between world religions and religious freedom, second, world religions and political pluralism. Then I will look at the character of a religious exclusivism and the reason why or why not a religious exclusivist may be political pluralist. And I will end with the example of Massachusetts Bay, very close to the founding of the United States, or it's in colonial America at that time, where I believe is actually a birth site of religious pluralism by an extremely exclusivistic religionist. So contention partly will be actually first cases in the birthplace and the birth environment of political pluralism is religious exclusivism. So this is roughly the road that we'll travel. Okay. First, freedom of religion and world religions. Let me remind you, one of the things that I mentioned yesterday, feature of world religion, is that it addresses itself to individual persons. All persons, irrespective of what group they belong, are summoned to respond to transcendent call, God's call. They either leave the network of the relationships they have and join a transnational body, church would be a very good example of that, or their faith is internally awakened and they remain within that body if they were born in an environment of the church. But it's addressed to an individual and through individual to community. Of course, there may be we can talk about Judaism in context of this description of world religions, and that will be a separate session, I'm sure. Now, each world religion also asserts that it is true, not merely in the sense of being appropriate for that person or for some group of people, but it is true universally for all human beings at all times and all places. World religions might tailor their message in a particular way, culturally appropriate ways. We talked yesterday about repertoire of motifs that can be configured in varieties of ways, but nonetheless, the claim to truth is fundamental to world religions. Now, the central point is this. In issuing a call to individuals to embrace a faith, to each individual to embrace a faith, world religions, I think, this is my argument, they assume, tacitly assume, that each person has both the capacity to espouse a way of life and responsibility for it. If I call you, if God calls you, the call of God assumes that you can hear the call and that you're responsible to embrace that call. Just as nobody can be born or die in the place of another person, so nobody can assume responsibility for basic direction of another person's life between birth and death. I think that's a fundamental conviction of world religions. Certainly is a fundamental conviction of the Christian faith. And that's kind of irrespective of Protestant or Catholic, Orthodox kind of ecumenical divides that may be there. So the fourth point, to have responsibility for the basic direction of one's life, a person must be free to make that decision about the direction of their life. Now, I would make an argument that person must be free across the entire span of their responsible lives. Freedom to embrace the way of life, freedom to leave a particular way of life and embrace another, a complete freedom of religion which goes hand in hand with divine call upon individual life. For every world religion, for Christian faith certainly as well, this freedom of religion or freedom to embrace a faith, freedom to set the direction of one's life is the most important freedom of all freedoms. It is the condition in which all other freedoms make sense. For freedom of religion is about being uncoerced in the setting of the direction of one's life rather than in one or the other thing that we do in the course of life that we have undertaken. And in that sense, it is the fundamental freedom of human beings. Many of the world religions have been ambivalent about freedom of religion, and we can talk for many, we can try to explain why this is the case. Again, it will take a lecture to explain this. Christianity has been ambivalent throughout its history about freedom of religion. Indeed, Catholic Church has fully embraced freedom of religion only at the Vatican II, right? And there are some reasons for that kind of ambivalence. The same is true of Buddhism. The same is, I think, true of Islam as well. I think that's probably the most relevant question for us today in terms of world religions. I think Quran contains probably the most robust affirmation of freedom of religion of any religious text that I know. And basically, you're probably familiar with that text. It's very often quoted. There is no compulsion in religion. Truth stands clear from error. Whoever rejects evil and believes in Allah had grasped the most trustworthy handhold that never breaks. That's a direct quotation from the Quran. Now, many great Muslim teachers have argued that this verse doesn't actually forbid forcing people to embrace Islam. It merely states that there's no need of compulsion in religion because the truth of Islam is self-evident. Others, many others, read the verse to imply that there should be no compulsion in religion. And building on this verse, a famous great Persian scholar has argued that compulsion in matters of religion is not only not necessary, but actually contrary to the nature of religion itself. God has not built faith upon compulsion and pressure, but on acceptance and free choice. That's kind of 12th century Muslim scholar. So you see emphasis is there on freedom of religion. Constraint of religion is also there in discussion. We can think about how Christians have managed the constraint and why they have imposed constraints, and the same might be true of other, or is true of other religions. So just as a brief introductory comment on freedom of religion, because that's fundamental to political pluralism. If you don't have freedom of religion, political pluralism, from my perspective, is really out, right? So you've got to have the two align. Now, let me say a few words about political pluralism, and then we'll go to religious exclusivism and political pluralism. Now, if we are in contemporary world, after political institutions that express and sustain mutual respect and freedom of people, two options are largely close to us, and two options, I believe, that are still often present among us and create quite a bit of problems. I've tried to analyze these options in the book that is outside as well, which is called A Public Faith. But these two options are, one is exclusion of religion from the public space. This is kind of a secularist exclusion of religion. The second problematic option is saturation of public space by a single religion or secular ideology. That has been historically prevalent in much of the world. I think it has been also even whether the religions are in question or secular ideologies like Marxist ideology. It's the one under which I grew up, right? A kind of secular totalitarianism. Now, the proponents of exclusion of religion insist that debates about political matters, that in those debates, citizens ought not to appeal to their sources, to their religious sources. And particularly difficult issue is how is it possible in public debates to make appeals to particular sources of authority like the scripture. So they have to have an independent source, and that independent source is something like a general reason. I won't go into this discussion, but John Locke is progenitor of that position, and in contemporary world, some of you who study political philosophy will recognize, at least if you squint, and broad contours of John Rawls's position. Right? But the trouble, of course, is that for religious people who base their lives, all of their lives, on their convictions about God, convictions that are rooted in particular revelations, that for religious people, that means exclusion from the public debate. So you're forced into privacy because you are not allowed to articulate yourself in the public domain in the way in which you feel that you ought to articulate yourself, that is in sync with who you are as a human being. Now, in response to this exclusion, adherents of world religion often aspire to use instruments of the state to dominate the entire political society. And that's when representative of one religion, or not just one religion, but one variety of a religion, right? So one sect within the religion, or one part of that religion, when they try to dominate the public life. And of course, the adherents of other religions then worry. Secularists also then worry. Universal social vision of one religion will collide with the universal social vision of another religion, of multiple other religions, and then social chaos, violence, and oppression will follow. And I think this worry is also justified, given the history of both religious, we can call it perhaps with some exaggeration, given religious totalitarianisms and given secular totalitarianism, that is, given religious saturation of the space by one religion, given secular saturation of entire political space by one religion, that worry is, I think, justified. Some of us have suffered under just such political regimes. And I think it was yesterday in the cathedral we heard a report of something like 100 million Christians being persecuted. A large percentage of those persecutions take place in the context in which one particular ideology or religious view dominates the entirety of the political space. So when you have these kinds of regimes, obviously consequences for minority religious groups are often very dire. Now, my argument would be that world religions have resources to affirm pluralism as a political project, that they don't need to push their competitors into privacy, and that they can create and sustain pluralistic environments in which minorities or parity groups are equally welcome. I think some of the constraints that are placed, what is essential for this would be the following. And I built here on the work of Charles Taylor and McClure. They have a very nice little book on freedom of conscience, which is very much worth reading. They make a very important distinction between constitutive moral principles of pluralistic political order and modes of implementation. Constitutive moral principles are, one, freedom of religion, or more broadly, freedom of conscience. I've argued earlier that world religions can affirm freedom of religion. Now, if you can't affirm freedom of religion, you don't have pluralistic political project. Only with affirmation of freedom of religion, that's possible. And second is the equal moral value of all citizens. It's not just that you're free as a religious person, but your contribution, you have equal voice with all others, right? Belonging to one group doesn't give you prefer access to public domain. You have equal voice in public matters. Precisely, I think, because world religions are universalistic, they affirm equal value of all people. Strictly speaking, and that may come as a surprise, and I can try to argue for this, for world religions, there are no insiders and outsiders when it comes to moral domain. Because moral commands are universal, you can't have insiders and outsiders. You may have insiders and outsiders with regard to salvation, with regard to communal belonging, but you can't have them in moral terms. And therefore, I think world religions affirm equal moral value of all citizens. Certainly, Christian faith does. Now, I think another very important feature, which belongs more to the modes of implementation, these were the key moral principles. The now next two are modes of implementation of political pluralism. Very important one, I think, is separation of religion and rule. Now, I have argued earlier, yesterday, that world religions affirm religion as a distinct cultural system, which is to say not unrelated to politics, but distinct in its own right, and actually the most significant cultural system. If that's true, the distinction between religion and politics is possible. Separation of religion and rule, or distinction of religion and rule, is possible as well. And then fourth is the impartiality of the state. State ought not to be partial toward any particular religious group or secular group. It ought to be impartial. Obviously, there are difficulties with this when you have great majorities and small minorities, how to orchestrate this, but nonetheless, as a principle, I think it holds true. So this is roughly a sketch: freedom of religion, in world religions, political pluralism in world religions. Now we come to the actual topic of our talk this morning, and that is the relationship between religious exclusivism and political pluralism. Can religious exclusivists embrace political pluralism? Now, and by that I mean, is it possible for them to be consistent in their views and embrace political pluralism? Or even more specifically, by this I mean, is it possible for them to embrace political pluralism not as a strategic or as a tactical goal, but as a matter of principle? Obviously, many religious exclusivists would say, well, for us to achieve these kinds of goals that we now have, and so we'll kind of acquiesce to political pluralism. Is it possible for religious exclusivists actually to be positive advocate of political pluralism? That's my question, right? And as you already know, my answer is going to be affirmative. And for that, I need to say a few words about what I understand under religious exclusivism, and I've already mentioned a bit about political exclusivism and pluralism. I'll just repeat that very briefly. But before I do that, I have forgotten to put my clock here so that I can pace myself. Well, here we go. So let's look first at religious exclusivism, and then just to remind ourselves, and then think about political exclusivism and pluralism, both religious exclusivism and religious pluralism. I think classic expression of a Christian religious exclusivism, and I'll primarily talk about Christian exclusivism here. Classic expression is the famous statement of Jesus in John's Gospel. I am the way and the truth and the life. No one comes to the Father except through me. Now, if you look at this text, religious exclusivism has three key features. One, exclusivists believe that their faith, their religion, is the true religion. That doesn't mean for most of them that there's no truth anywhere else except in their religion. The truth can be recognized in wider society. Also, the truth can be recognized in other religions, but all truth is judged on the basis of the revelation, the truth that religious exclusivists believe that they possess. In this case, on the basis of who Jesus Christ is. Second, religious exclusivists believe that their faith alone is the right path to God for everyone. It alone fosters fully, authentically human flourishing. It alone assures everlasting life. Doesn't mean that other faiths don't contain any truth. It simply means, again, that this is the criterion of the rightness of living. One is the rightness of believing, if you want. The other one is rightness of living. And finally, and this is also very, very important in the entire debate, for religious exclusivists, the final source of authority is the positive revelation contained in the Holy Bible for Christians, right? Or Holy Bible and the sacred tradition, depending on the tradition which you come. The central thing here is that it's the positive revelation, meaning that it's not something that's accessible to reason outside of the content of revelation, but it goes back to what is contained in the revealed books. Now, the great Protestant theologian Friedrich Schleiermacher, you can be, I have immense respect for Schleiermacher, probably more, as much respect as for any other theologian, but he's really wrong on so many things, right? So it's possible to be really wrong and to be really great, right? At least I think so. Friedrich Schleiermacher has, I think, rightly noted that when it comes to revelation, the concept of revelation is distinct from, when we speak about revealed truths, they're distinct as things that we have excogitated in our mind. Typical example of excogitation would be Descartes sitting in his warm stove and coming to this great insight, cogito ergo sum, right? That's the kind of insight through simple acts of reason. Or the other contrast of revelation is something that you can find empirically before you, right? Discover. Either excogitate or discover. Now, revelation is contrasted to both of these ways in which we come to know things. And it's based on the positive self-disclosure of God in a particular person or in a particular book. Now, for religious exclusivists, this is a very important piece of the entire package. Now, in contrast to religious exclusivism, religious pluralism is a conviction that all religions, world religions, all religions, are roughly equally true, provide equally valid access to the divine, foster flourishing, good life of human beings equally well. They're equally good ways of achieving hoped for everlasting life. Now, religions might differ. They differ in rituals, they differ in convictions, they differ in practices because they have emerged in different social and cultural settings. Each may have its own unique emphasis. For instance, Buddhism might be emphasis on overcoming suffering, Christianity on love, Islam on submission, and so on. They may be like in the Catholic orders in the Catholic Church, right? They have their own charisms. And that's the way in which some people think about religions. Basically, each has their own charism, but each is an appropriate and adequate way to reach the divine reality. The metaphor that is often used is that each is a line connecting the circumference of a circle, and wherever human beings stand, they're equidistant from the center toward which they ought to be going. Now, some people then argue that you've got to have this kind of pluralistic account of religion if you want to embrace pluralism as a political project, right? I think that's a mistaken position. Let me contrast now, talk about political exclusivism just very briefly, and then political pluralism, and I'll then try to build my argument for the thesis that I'm advocating. Now, this extreme form of political exclusivism is obviously totalitarianism. It was instantiated most explicitly and most destructively in Nazi and Stalinist regimes in the last century. And these regimes were built on the ideological fiction of one official truth, one acceptable way of life. They were legitimized by the myth of an inescapable war between noble and degenerate races, or on the philosophy of history's ineluctable march toward classless society. They are maintained by terror of a single uncontested rule, and common, this was more extreme form, but common to all forms of political exclusivism, is that government is highly partial to one ideology, to one religion, to one ethnic group, and that it employs coercive mechanisms to exclude others from participating in public life, and in extreme form to exterminate them from the public body as a whole. In the 20th century, political exclusivism was associated with irreligious, anti-religious totalitarianisms, but throughout history, political exclusivism was largely religiously inspired. That's an important thing for us to keep in mind, and that connects with the idea traditional idea that is present with humanity through the centuries of the tight unity between kind of moral sense of a particular community, religion, and the political rule, so-called Durkheimian account of the relationship between religion and society. Now, political pluralism is a position that I have advocated earlier, and by this I refer that to a kind of political philosophy and political practice in which freedom is guaranteed to all people, irrespective of their faith or lack of it, and they'll all have equal voice in running the affairs of the common public life. And the state is impartial with regard to overarching interpretation of life. Now, if with these kinds of definitions in mind, the question that I asked at the beginning rises as a very significant one. Is it possible in today's environment in which we have a pluralistic society, in which we have social pluralism in most societies, or in many societies, and increasingly have social pluralism, is it possible to embrace religious exclusivism and still advocate pluralism as a political project? Now, the question is particularly important because of the vibrancy of religious exclusivism. Yesterday, I spoke of the vibrancy of religions in general, that religions in general, world religions, are growing in absolute and relative terms, right? But I think it's important also to observe that great majority of religious people are in fact religious exclusivists. Let's start with moderate Islamic majority countries like Turkey, and I might be Indonesia. With regard to Turkey, I might be corrected on this. Over 60% of Muslims are religious exclusivists. At least that's what, according to some of the data that I have seen. The percentage is much higher in conservative Muslim countries. Now, Christians are more exclusivistic than just about any other religious group. Christians in Africa, in China, where Christianity is vibrant and rapidly growing, 87% of Christians are religious exclusivists. I'm a certain kind of religious exclusivist, if you ask me, really, because I think that there is no other option. There is an option. This is another lecture also to have, but you can expand the circle of exclusivity, but you can't get rid of exclusivity, right? You can include more people within your circle, but you can't stop being exclusive. Every determination is a negation. If that's true, you're excluding somebody and something, right? And even the most pluralistic accounts of religions are exclusivistic in significant ways. Take John Hick's interpretation of religion, and exclusivism is part and parcel of that, even though it calls itself pluralistic account of religion. End of a footnote. Back to my lecture. Okay. 87%, as I said, of Christians in Africa, China, are religious exclusivists. The percentage of Christians who are exclusivists fall below 50% only in nominally Christian Western or Western-influenced nations. Hindus, often described as religiously tolerant, are predominantly exclusivists when it comes to truth claims of their faith. Now, if this is true, most adherents of world religions are religious exclusivists. That's what figures that I've just given you suggest. And given the character of world religions, I think that's what we should expect. As I noted earlier in this lecture, fundamental to major world religions, especially to monotheisms, is the distinction between true and false religion. That's part and parcel of their DNA, so to speak. And therefore, also, rejection of false religion. Now, you can see that for Jews, Christians, and Muslims, this is built into the very pillars of their faith. The first divine commandment, what is it? It's not formulated positively. It's formulated exclusivistically. You shall have no other gods before me, right? Or first pillar of Islam, there is no God but God. You see it right there, that this no is a gesture of a kind of rejection, gesture of exclusivity. Obviously, they were formulated in the polytheistic kinds of contexts, and then this gesture of rejection is a condition of possibility of affirmation. But it's important to keep that in mind as we look at these texts. So the pillars of Judaism, Christianity, Islam are exclusivistic. Moreover, in them the distinction between true and false God, between true and false religions, rests on a very specific revelation. In the case of Judaism, on the revelation of God in Sinai. Same is true also in different way for Islam. So the revealed character of these religions strengthens exclusivism. So if the figures are correct, between 2.5 and 3.5 billion people today are religious exclusivists. And religions are growing, both in absolute and relative terms, as I said, and religions that are growing most are the religions of people among the people who are themselves exclusivistic. Most vibrant, numerically growing, and publicly assertive religions, just the sort of religion that makes it most difference politically, is predominantly exclusivistic. To the extent that there are religious exclusivists, people of diverse religions, will they be able to live together in peace? That's the fundamental question, I think, that globalization places before us. The world is shrinking. We're coming closer together. We're intermingling with each other under the same political roof, but we are still continue to be, and growingly continue to be, religious exclusivists. And so fundamental question that we are facing today, one of the fundamental questions, is what to do about that fact. Now, there are people who say we shouldn't do anything, we shouldn't worry too much about this, at least not in the long run. Maybe in the short run, but not in the long run. And reason for that we shouldn't worry, is that globalization processes are turning all religious peoples into religious pluralists simply by pushing them to live together in close proximity with one another. Different faiths intermingling in close proximity with one another. And once people become religious pluralists, political pluralism will follow, and we'll have a solution. In the meantime, I don't know how long it's going to last. Suggestion is we can live with these kinds of tensions, but worry is not to be exaggerated. Famous sociologist, some of you have read, I'm sure, his works, Peter Berger, in a small book titled A Far Glory, advocates just such gradual disappearance of religious exclusivism. He believes that social pluralism, that is to say the coexistence with a measure of civic peace of different groups in a single society, this kind of social pluralism, erodes religious exclusivism and leads to affirmation of religious pluralism. Processes of globalization are increasing social pluralism, right? And they therefore lead to religious pluralism. And the way they do so, according to Berger, is through the process of cognitive contamination. Here's what he means by cognitive contamination. I'm reading the text from you. The thought occurs to them that one's traditional ways of looking at the world may not be the only plausible ones, that maybe these other people have a point or two. The worldview that until now was taken for granted is opened up, very slightly at first, to a glimmer of doubt. Now, this glimmer of doubt is the cognitive contamination, right? It's open to the glimmer of doubt. This opening has a way of expanding rapidly. The end point may be then a pervasive relativism. All right? When people of diverse religions reside side by side, this tends to attenuate their views, right? And roughly the process as he described it goes like this. If you live with others, right? And then over time, you learn to appreciate them as human beings. Then you realize that their beliefs are not utterly false and their ways of living not completely pernicious. And then you eventually conclude that their truth is as good as yours. That's the basic thesis of the process. This is social, it's an experiment or exercise in social psychology, right? To describe how people in social settings believe and how their beliefs are affected by the ways of their social living. You know, and you might think that the scheme, as he has suggested it, looks persuasive, but actually what happens in life is much more complicated. Even when people go through first 3 stages, you live together, you learn to appreciate, you realize that their beliefs are not utterly false, it doesn't often lead to the fourth conclusion. You eventually conclude they're as good, their truth is as good as yours. They don't turn into religious pluralists. On the contrary, cohabitation with different adherents of other religions often strengthens rather than weakening one's own faith commitments. And in fact, most sociologists today have come to believe the thesis that's exactly opposite of the one that Berger has advocated here. There is no negative correlation between social pluralism and strength of conviction. Sometimes, often, there is actually a positive correlation between the two. When you are with somebody who is different, that might even heighten your own investment in your own religion, because to preserve identity, other reasons that you might have for that. And often the examples that people give of such concrete situations would be example of India, probably religiously most pluralistic and one of the religiously most vibrant countries. The other example is that of the United States. Certainly coexistence of various groups has not led to diminishment of investment of each one of them in their own beliefs. Okay. So basically, if Berger is not right, if my critique of Berger, or rather if the sociologist's critique of Berger is correct, then we are left with a situation of kind of abiding social pluralism, religious pluralism, and then the question of what happens with religious exclusivism. Because globalization is pushing people of diverse religious persuasions to live in the same political society. If you can't be religious exclusivist and political pluralist, then in a world of vibrant and assertive religions sharing common political space, you're left with 2 major options. And this option would be, first, let's try to persuade religious exclusivists to become religious pluralists. That might be your option, right? And chances that you will succeed in that, I think, are roughly close to 0, right? Because religious exclusivism, in part, is there because of the strong investments of people in their positions, and besides, it's not such a persuasive position to have in the first place. Second, you can exclude religious exclusivists from public life, which is a strategy of programmatically secular state. But that strategy, of course, is highly oppressive to increasing number of people, right? If religions are growing, vibrant, and politically assertive, if you exclude them from public domain, public realm, you are actually enacting an extraordinary amount of oppression in the world today. We see that with persecution of various religious groups. We see that sometimes persecution also of non-believers as well. So we've got to somehow figure out whether in fact it's possible, right? The thesis that I'm advocating. The text that I have here before me, I'll think because of time, I'll have to skip this. I engage two major political philosophies that advocate some form of exclusivism or exclusion of religious exclusivists from political domain. One of them is a recent example, a very influential text of Karl Popper, which is Open Society and Its Enemies, a book that he wrote while he was in New Zealand and observing what was happening in Germany as well, kind of as looking at further out east on Stalinist Russia or Soviet Union at that time. He advocated the basic idea that if you have a source of authority that is not open to reason, you will be political totalitarian, right? So religious exclusivists, because they base their arguments on the revealed books, will be by definition prone to be political totalitarians. That's kind of Karl Popper argument. You've got to have kind of this reasoned argument, and reason has to go all the way down for you to be able to be political pluralist. The other influential text from much earlier on is Jean-Jacques Rousseau's Social Contract. This is probably the most famous text, and he is very adamant about excluding exclusivists from the public space. You recall his text. I'll read maybe a section of it. Those who distinguish civil intolerance from theological intolerance, those who distinguish political pluralism and religious pluralism, right, I'm translating my terms, are in my opinion mistaken. These two kinds of intolerance are inseparable. And he says, it is impossible to live in peace with people whom we believe to be damned. To love them would be to hate God who punishes them. It is absolutely necessary to reclaim them or to punish them. Wherever theological intolerance is allowed, wherever religious exclusivists reign, it cannot but have effect on civil life. And as soon as it has any effect on civil life, the sovereign is no longer sovereign, even in secular affairs, and then the priests are the real masters. And therefore, as he argued in that same book, whoever says outside the church there is no salvation, which would be one version of religious exclusivism, right, ought to be driven from the state, right? So you have here the radical example of kind of somebody who advocates political pluralism but feels that they must exclude religious exclusivists. Now, I think that the best argument that one can give that the two are actually compatible and possible is to look at the origins of contemporary political pluralism. And I think origins, it's a very complicated story of origins, but the first place where political pluralism wasn't just formulated as an idea, but was actually embodied in legislation, in constitution, was in colonial United States. And the great hero of that period is Roger Williams. Roger Williams, who lived in 1603 to 1683. First government in the world which broke church and state apart and embodied in its constitution radical freedom of religion, stronger freedom of religion than John Locke advocated a few years later. Now, if the proof was needed that religious exclusivists can be political exclusivists, right? If religious and political exclusivism go together, if the proof is needed, I think you can't find a better proof, or you can, as good of a proof as any, is the political leaders of Massachusetts Bay Colony, kind of around Boston, with their leader who was John Winthrop. This is a famous vision of the city placed on a hill, dedicated to God and obeying God's laws. the role of the government is to enforce God's laws, and only if the government is the kind of master who watches over how the people behave can people actually obey divine laws, and when they obey, God is going to bless the nation. Flogging, mutilation, such as cutting off ears and cutting out of tongues, and in cases of adultery, idolatry, and blasphemy, executions were some of the punishments for disobedience. Massachusetts Bay. I sometimes tease my American friends when I speak about these things. I think America was founded as a Taliban state. And they don't like the idea, but basically, roughly, the idea is there, right? Now, you Swiss have a little bit milder forms of that, but don't be too proud of yourself. Calvin's Geneva, I know it's a better example, but it's the same trajectory of thinking, I think. And of course, neither Massachusetts Bay nor Geneva were exceptions to the more general rule in the kind of development of Christian understanding of relationship between religion and politics. So, when Roger Williams first arrived to the colony, this was in February 1631, its leaders, John Winthrop, the same John Winthrop that about whom I just talked, was a good friend of his, and they greeted him as a godly and zealous preacher. He was 28 years of age and was offered one of the most important and highly influential positions in deeply religious colonial America. He was to be the teacher of the Boston church, and therefore an authoritative religious thinker for the entire colony. Remember, the entire colony is dedicated to obeying God's laws. He's going to be the chief guy, yeah, right? He's going to be religious authority as a preacher of the main church in Boston. To their stunned surprise, Williams refused the honor. 20-year-old refused the honor. For him, the Boston Puritans were not separate enough from the Church of England. 5 years later, just a few months before they founded Harvard College, the magistrate expelled Roger Williams, who wouldn't be their preacher. What was his offense? He advocated the seditious doctrine that magistrates had no right to enforce obedience to the first table of the law, the portion of the Ten Commandments that regulates human duties to God. On this, Williams collided with Winthrop as well. The two remained kind of tense friends, but Winthrop was the one who expelled Williams. And Williams then wrote a long treatise, 400-page book, that he wrote in defense of religious freedom. He defended his position over against others. And he stated, "It is the will and command of God that since the coming of his Son, Lord Jesus, a permission of the most paganish, Jewish, Turkish, or anti-Christians' consciences and worships be granted to all nations and countries. And they are only to be fought with that sword which is only in matters of the soul, able to conquer. And that is the sword of God's Spirit, the sword of God's Word." So basically, you have an affirmation of fundamental freedom of all, right? That's much broader than Locke ever formulated, because he wasn't so sure about Muslims. He wasn't so sure about Catholics either, by the way, because they had allegiance to Vatican, right? And Muslims have apparently allegiance to their Grand Mufti in Istanbul or something of that sort, was on his view, so that they have to be kind of have divided loyalties. Nothing of that in Roger Williams. And as you see, actually, it was motivated profoundly by theological reasons. No pragmatism is involved. To the contrary, right? He sacrificed his own position of authority in order to advocate freedom of conscience wanted to advocate a kind of idea in which all people have exactly equal rights. He believed that it's directly contrary to the nature of Jesus Christ, his saints and truths, that throats of men should be torn out for his sake, who most delighted to converse with greatest sinners. So you have the idea of Christ's attention to the most sinful cannot be in any way made compatible with not just worse forms of coercion, but with any forms of coercion in the matter of religion. So writer on Roger Williams sums up his position. It's a book which is very much worth reading. It's a fun read. It's called Roger Williams and the Creation of the American Soul. The author is John Barry. He writes, with absolute faith in the Bible, with absolute faith in his own interpretation of it, he nonetheless believed it monstrous to compel another person to believe what he or anyone else believed, or to compel conformity to his or anyone else's belief. Williams incorporated his deeply held religious conviction, formulated in a religiously highly exclusivistic framework, into the state compact of Rhode Island. It's a state which borders the state in which I live, Connecticut, which he founded for the express purpose of building into the character of its political institution his idea about religious liberty and the separation of the church and state. A strong religious exclusivist, he became one of the founders of political pluralism. And all his biographers agree, his faith was both the source of his convictions and motivation for his actions, not mere instrument of achieving what were only social and political ends. For Winthrop, God would not be honored and would not bless the fledgling colony unless it obeyed God's laws, and the colony could not obey God's laws unless the government enforced them. For Williams, God is insulted by forced worship and brutal punishments to enforce religious conformity, and they're contrary to the character of the merciful God revealed in Jesus Christ. Both of them were devout Christians. Both were religious exclusivists. Yet Winthrop's religious exclusivism led to political exclusivism, while Williams became political pluralist. The content of faith made a difference, not whether it was exclusivistic or not, whether it was strongly held or not, but what one, in fact, believed. And I think it can be shown that, certainly from Christian perspective, the content of belief is more likely to nudge you in the direction of political pluralism than it is in the direction of political exclusivism. Thank you very much.